Okay, so Ibogaine. Ibogaine is a naturally occurring indole alkaloid. Like we said, an alkaloid, the indole ring is the basis for tryptamine alkaloids. Although Ibogaine has a much more complex molecular structure than the tryptamine alkaloids and has a very different pharmacology. Essentially, tryptamines are also indole alkaloids, but not all indole alkaloids are tryptamines. Ibogaine as well is also a psychedelic under the lumper terminology. Ibogaine is the main alkaloid, psychoactive alkaloid present in the root bark of the Tabernath iboga plant. Tabernath iboga is a plant that is predominantly present in Africa, West Africa especially. And although we're lumping it in the category of psychedelics for this discussion, it would be actually better described as an oneirogen, which is a compound that facilitates dreams. And the reason for this is that, unlike the kind of like open-eyed psychedelic visual types of things that can happen when we're under the effects of something like LSD or psilocybin, I know we didn't talk about LSD, but I'm just going to assume that if you know what psychedelics are, you've at least heard of LSD. Ibogaine, and I don't know this personally because I've never experienced Ibogaine at this point in my life, seems to create these incredibly immersive worlds and these scenes that you go into that happen under closed eyes, similar to like being in a waking dream, but are only present when your eyes are closed. So this is why it might be more accurate to describe Ibogaine as an oneirogen rather than as a psychedelic. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we'll call it a psychedelic. The mechanisms by which Ibogaine works is incredible. This molecule works on so many different targets in the brain. It works on serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, glutamate, GABA, OCT2, ion channels, receptor tyrosine kinases, and affects each of these systems in different ways simultaneously. Like it is it's just like an incredibly complex molecule that does things to the brain that we really don't understand yet how or why it does what it does. Nolan Williams, who I mentioned at the beginning when I started using the terminology of splitters versus lumpers, I had him on the show to talk about Ibogaine as a treatment for concussion, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he used this incredible metaphor. He said, the way that we're thinking about how molecules affect brain function is almost like a 14th century key. We think about like, oh, we use this molecule and it affects this particular neural system and it makes changes. And that we see it as relatively simple. I mean, we don't see it as simple, but like our ability to utilize molecules to affect these systems, we're thinking about it from a simple way. You think about SSRI. It's like, oh, we're going to have these effects on the brain by selectively targeting specific serotonin receptors and inhibiting a specific function in serotonin to create these effects. Okay, that's like a 14th century key. He describes Ibogaine as like an advanced modern key, which it just functions in such a complex way to produce its results that it's borderline inconceivable between the simplicity of the 14th century key and the modern key. I use the photos here that you see on the bottom right of the slide where you've got this very simple key, as you can imagine, like an old skeleton key. And on the right, you have a key for like a modern electric car, which is basically just a fob and it's got a touch screen. You can control the car's functions like within on the key from a distance. Like the difference between these two like these two keys and what they can do is incredible. You can almost consider it something like the difference between like picking up an old rotary phone to call on the landline and the cell phone in your pocket today. This is like the difference in how complex the mechanisms are of these molecules. Now, in terms of effects, we have closed-eye visuals. Like I said, close your eyes and it enters into an extremely immersive and visual experience in your mind's eye, like a dream. Interestingly, with Ibogaine, with Ibogaine, there is what is often described as autobiographical visions, sometimes like a life review. If you've ever heard the stories of people who die and they go through a whole life review from the beginning to the end, and they go through their whole life and assess all their choices and so on and so forth, and then they come back with a new perspective, assuming they come back to tell the tale. Ibogaine seems to produce something like this. Some even say that there's a spirit there that helps guide it and kind of like informs strongly for us to accept the reality of like the consequences of our actions and choices as we go through and review our lives and the choices that we made and how they've contributed to where we are and how the role other people played and how we perceive ourselves in the world. And that this is a quintessential part of the Ibogaine experience. They can also be incredibly challenging. Like all psychedelic substances can be challenging. Even MDMA can be challenging, despite how like lovey-dovey and pleasant it can feel. It can also have overwhelming and challenging aspects. But Ibogaine is particularly uniquely challenging. It is incredibly long-lasting. We could think of LSD as lasting a very long time at like 10-ish hours. Well, Ibogaine can last 24 hours up to 30 hours. And in that time frame, any kind of movement can contribute to nausea or vomiting or just like retching and discomfort. And this can go on for a very long time. So because of this, outside of certain circumstances and cultural scenarios at very low doses, there's little to no recreational use of Ibogaine. It's predominantly used in ceremonial or therapeutic settings. And on top of that is the only psychedelic, quote, psychedelic, whose physiological effects can directly result in death. Now, it is, okay, so outside of MDMA, which could cause death in the scenario of what's called serotonin syndrome, you have too much MDMA, for example, or it's mixed with the wrong substances, and you have such an increase of serotonin that you can't regulate. You go into what's called hyperthermia. Your body can't regulate its temperature, and you basically start to burn up, and then your brain fries out and you vomit yourself to death. It's terrible. People do die that way with MDMA, and it's very sad. But with other psychedelics, sure, people could die by making terrible choices while they're under the influence, hurting themselves or walking out into traffic. But the psychedelic effects don't directly cause death. Like you don't, like the LSD doesn't kill a person. Psilocybin doesn't kill a person. Someone could die as a consequence of the choices they make on it, but it's not direct. Ibogaine isn't like that. There's a possibility that because of how Ibogaine affects cardiac functioning, it slows the heart rate down so slow, sometimes as low as 50 beats a minute. This is very slow, that if a person has a irregularity in what's called their QT interval, which is the interval between heartbeats, if there's an irregularity there, Ibogaine can produce what's called Torsades syndrome, where the heart doesn't start beating again. It slows down so much that in between beats, it just stops. Now, the actual record we have of people dying through Torsades syndrome, through Ibogaine, is sparse, and pretty much every single example was because there wasn't good medical screening in advance, or that person was already very ill, because a lot of the people who we have a history of taking Ibogaine outside of its traditional uses in Africa, which we'll talk about in a second, generally is people who are undergoing long periods of addiction. We're going to talk about that in a sec. But nonetheless, it's the only psychedelic that can directly result in death. Something else that I wanted to mention about the experience that's unique is that on top of going through autobiographical visions, it also seems to increase, like there's a high rate of people encountering what they would call their ancestors or communication with dead loved ones. Happens on other psychedelics as well, but it seems to be something unique about Ibogaine, and that the connection with ancestors and dead loved ones is a part of this life review, unique to Ibogaine. Okay, so let's talk about Ibogaine's history. So Ibogaine's been used by centuries by the Bwiti people of West Africa in initiation and ceremonial practices. Now, mind you, they're not using Ibogaine, they're using the root bark of the Tabernacle Iboga plant. They're using Iboga, but it has been a part of their traditional history for hundreds of years. In 1901, Ibogaine was first synthesized by French researchers and was actually at one point sold as a stimulant in France in the form of what was called lambarine, pardon my pronunciation there. And speaking of recreational purposes, it was for a while sold in France as a recreational drug from 1930s to 1960s, and it was only withdrawn from the market when Ibogaine itself was made illegal by the French government in 1966. Now, when I mentioned before about how oftentimes people outside of traditional context who are taking Ibogaine end up being people who have spent long periods of time in addiction, this is because in 1962, a man named Howard Lotsof accidentally discovered its anti-addictive effects. Effectively, if I remember this correctly, they used heroin and they tried Ibogaine as like a new kind of drug that they wanted to like try out, that they're experimenting with. And they came out on the other side of that, where their dependence, which is physiological, their need for heroin, and their addiction, the sort of non-physiological, the psycho-emotional, social aspect of addiction, was gone. And since then, he started to offer it to others, and it got to a point where it became on the underground a way in which people could get off heroin, get off opiates that they were addicted to. And even now, it is the only drug that we know of that can effectively stop opioid withdrawals within a few hours of administration. And in a supportive context, it makes it so that people come out the other side of it, for the most part, no longer physically dependent on the opiate and no longer addicted. And part of that being the life review, the autobiographical review that they go through, and how that changes their relationship to the substance. Now, this isn't a solution to addiction, but people can still go back in and end up back on heroin, of course. But it's incredible that the effects that we have, mostly anecdotally, because we don't have a lot of good medical research on its anti-addictive effects, but we have incredible amounts of anecdotal evidence on its ability to stop opioid addiction, to cease the addiction, to cease the dependence, and give people a new lease on life. And primarily, that is where Ibogaine treatment sort of rests in the larger scheme of psychedelic research, is mostly treatment centers that operate in countries where it's legal, where they're predominantly targeting addiction, although research into its mechanisms and different uses continues, such as with head injury, we'll talk about in a second. And of course, there's still an underground, there's still a bit of a tourist, psychedelic tourism industry for going to countries like Gabon to have what's called a traditional Bwitia initiation, non-tourism, like genuine spiritual initiation there for people who aren't necessarily African. And there's underground networks of people using Ibogaine for a more spiritual or therapeutic PTSD and so on and so forth, not just addiction. So it exists in the underground for a wide dynamic of uses, the same as ayahuasca might, although admittedly to a different degree of presence. But primarily, a lot of it is for addiction. Now, when we look at Ibogaine's medical uses, like I said, we have the anti-addictive effect in the aftermath of the Ibogaine experience. People go in addicted to heroin for 15 years and face everything in their lives that led them to that addiction and all that came out of it, and then they exit the experience physiologically cleaned of the drug and empowered to change their lives away from that addiction after only a single session. We have no other drug that does this. The best option that we have right now as a medical institution in at least North America is to help people get off opiate drugs by putting them on another opiate drug that they're dependent on, which is effectively methadone treatment. The ability to have a drug that can clear people of this addiction is incredible. It's just complicated because, well, people could die. It's a 30-hour psychedelic experience. There's a lot of complexities that prevents it from being more present in our medical institutions, despite the data that we have on it. So let's see. We've discussed non-opioid drug. Oh, it's a non-opioid drug that can stop opioid withdrawal symptoms, reverse opioid tolerance or dependency, seemingly free, quote, free people of addiction. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that research in the last few years, particularly through Nolan Williams at Stanford, have found that treatment with Ibogaine can help reverse TBI, mild traumatic brain injury, or concussion. Effectively, we have these people going in, predominantly they're veterans, and they all have concussion, usually blast injury. I believe they were all in the mild category, and I want to clarify that a mild TBI, traumatic brain injury, doesn't mean mild in impact. It just means that there isn't any like traumatic damage to the brain. Like a moderate to severe, you could go through a CAT scan and you could see like pieces of the brain are just gone. Like that's a severe brain injury. You have it's like moderate brain injury, you can see damage. A mild traumatic brain injury is that you can't really see the damage outside of very specialized, highly expensive equipment like a functional MRI. But you can track the damage through its functional consequences. So somebody being having reduced cognitive energy or reduced ability to communicate or sensory challenges, or one of the hallmarks of TBI or concussion is not just, cognitive functional challenges, but emotional dysregulation, increased rates of depression, increased rates of suicide. It's hard to live with a brain injury in a lot of ways, especially hard that people don't really see it on the outside. Unlike a broken leg in a cast, you could tell how much that impacts someone's life. But if somebody's talking mostly normally, you have a good reason to assume that they're probably mostly fine. And that is not always the case. Anyways, so try not to get too personal about this here. You have these individuals that are going in to these experiences, these people who have been with their concussion for more than 2 years, and they all through a number of different sort of like surveys that would track disability status. They all qualified. This person is qualifiably disabled by their concussion. They go in, they have their Ibogaine experience, they come out the other side, same metrics, same surveys, they no longer qualify for disability. And that this sustains for at least a year. We have no other drug whatsoever. We have at best guesses and compensations that can help people after mild traumatic brain injury, after concussion, kind of get back some of their function and try to rehabilitate as much as possible. But for a lot of people, especially if they've had multiple concussions, it just gets to a certain point and it just doesn't get better. And there's nothing we can do. There's no pharmacological treatment we have to help get their brain back to healthy. And it seems like Ibogaine does this in a single session, and it sustains for at least a year. And last I heard, it was still sustained after 2 years since this research. They can even they did, like I said, very sophisticated, highly expensive imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging that can show changes. Like you could see like, okay, here's where that injury is before the Ibogaine. After the Ibogaine, it's gone. After a single session. And we just don't have any other drug to do this. It's absolutely incredible. One of the comments I heard was something like it can de-age the brain by 2 years or 1 point some odd years as well. I'll let you just research that yourself because it's very curious to think that if aging as a natural sort of degradation of brain function as a natural consequence of molecular operation over time, basically aging, causes this damage, and Ibogaine seems to reduce and reverse some of that damage. I mean, there's obviously the concussion stuff here, but then there's the other question of just like the idea of de-aging the brain. And most recently that I heard, at least as of last year, is that they showed it as a potential treatment for multiple sclerosis. Effectively, that Ibogaine seems to reduce the presence of the lesions that multiple sclerosis has on the brain. So multiple sclerosis generates these lesions on the brain that is a part of it as a as a disease, and Ibogaine seems to reduce those lesions. So here we have this molecule from this ancient plant. I mean, all plants are ancient, that has this incredibly advanced pharmacology that we're barely even, that not only have we barely scratched the surface of how it works, but like it reveals things about the interfunctionality of the brain that is, itself beyond what we already understood. Pushing our understanding of basically how we can selectively target functions within the brain through pharmacology. And it does these amazing things that we have no other treatments for. Incredible.